Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in GCSE psychology for Edexcel. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to do is summarize and finish off our studies of the section on memory, talking about how the memory works, by looking at the reductionism and holism debate, which is cited at the bottom of the specification there. Now, it is very likely that I'm going to go back over a lot of this content in the future and just sort of plug in any gaps in areas that I maybe brushed over a bit too quickly, or maybe I want to elaborate in more detail for you. But for now, we will move on after this to looking at the next major topic, which concerns the issue of depression. And then we'll talk about addiction, and then we will talk about neuropsychology. So this video is going to be about, as I mentioned, the reductionism and holism debate in psychology. Now, this is a debate which centers around how best to explain human behavior and mental processes. Now, ultimately, the reductionism and holism debate is a debate with two contrasting opinions. On the one hand, you have reductionism, which focuses on breaking down behavior into its smallest component parts, i.e., reducing things down to their most simple parts. And then the holism debate emphasizes the idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So let's get into this debate, and let's get into looking at the first factor, the first feature of this debate. So the idea of reductionism in psychology is essentially the belief that you have complex behaviors and that they can be explained by breaking them down into more simple, more fundamental component parts. So where you have complex behaviors, where you have, let's say, complex thoughts or even complex feelings, we can understand those thoughts and feelings and emotions or whatever by breaking them down into simpler, more fundamental component features. It holds then that by understanding the basic components, we can fully understand the more holistic, the more constructed human psychology. Now, it has a number of different features, it has a number of different theories, it has a number of different ideas, one of which is, of course, the approach from a biological perspective, the approach emphasizing the biological and physiological factors that occur in the brain, so the brain itself, for example, or the hormones that take place within the body, or the genetic features of different parts of the human body, that these all influence behavior. So we could take the example of mental illnesses like depression being seen as the result of chemical imbalances in the brain, or some potentially genetic predispositions, so things like schizophrenia, for example. This is one of the explanations from the perspective of reductionism. You will also have this idea of psychological reductionism, which takes a very similar approach, but from the perspective of human behavior. And so trying to break down human behavior as the product of smaller measurable units. One such example of this is the behaviorists B.F. Skinner, who explained human actions purely through the lens of conditioning and reinforcement, and ignored other factors like cognition and emotions. We'll get to Skinner, I believe, in future videos when we start looking at other factors, things like social influence, or if you decide that you want to take psychology onto A level, then you definitely deal with Skinner at that point as well. And then another point is this idea of methodological reductionism. This is the approach that involves simplifying complex psychological phenomena to make them much easier to study. So this takes an approach that is not necessarily limited to biology or to psychology, but is limited to the ways in which you approach those subjects. That's what methodology essentially means. Methodology is essentially how you come about a conclusion. Or when you conduct research, how you are going to conduct research. Are you going to, from a broad perspective, methodology might involve reading lots of books and coming to conclusions there. Like a historian, for example, might read lots of books and that might be their methodology, or might go into the archives and look at, and that might be their methodology. A scientist's methodology is essentially the experiments they conduct, how they conduct those experiments, and why they are conducting those experiments in the way that they are. Why that type of methodology, why that method of experimentation is beneficial to come to the conclusions that they want to arrive at. So an experiment may isolate one variable at a time to try and identify the cause and effect relationships between that variable and other variables. This is an idea of methodological reductionism. So within this then, there is obviously an assessment that we can think about in relation to this, to reductionism, i.e. we can look at the strengths and the criticisms, the weaknesses of such an approach. Well, in terms of the strengths of reductionism does in fact allow for a more precise and scientific approach because it can make things like behaviors or biological factors or methodological factors more manageable and more understandable by focusing on the simpler isolated components. I don't know if you've realized this yet or throughout your studies in GCSE psychology, but the brain is quite complicated. The brain is, by all accounts, the most complicated thing that we have ever discovered in nature, essentially. There is nothing more complicated than the human brain, or any brains, really. And so it might be seen as a necessary feature of studying the brain, that if we want to understand the brain, we have to break it down into manageable, simple components. Maybe it is impossible to ever fully come to a comprehensive understanding of the brain in its entirety, but we can get really, really good at studying very specific aspects of the brain, or the biology of the brain, or the psychology of the brain, or the methodological approaches to how we deal with understanding the brain. A further strength of reductionism is that it often leads to specific interventions or treatments that are based on clear identified causes. So if you are using reductionism to approach mental illnesses, then looking at it from, let's say, a biological perspective or a psychological perspective can potentially identify very specific causes and hopefully treat those causes with very specific interventions or treatments. And that can actually have a real measurable impact on those individuals who have those potential disorders. So medication for mental health disorders, for example. In terms of weaknesses, of course, the first weakness that you will always think about is the fact that it is a very oversimplified approach to looking at the brain. Complex human behavior might not be able to be fully understood by reducing it to its smallest component parts. It might be the case that the smallest component parts are in fact still very, very large, complex issues that you need to deal with. Additionally, the breaking down of human behavior into its smallest component parts might in fact ignore the broader context and the interaction between different elements. It might be the case that the smallest part of one component does not act in the way that it does without the context of the interaction of other elements, meaning that you should really deal with this in a much more holistic and a much more broad process. It should also be noted that the idea of reductionism ignores social and environmental factors. It may neglect how broader psychological or broader social or even broader cultural factors can contribute to the changing in someone's behavior, especially from the perspective of psychological reductionism. And then finally, critics argue that reductionism can overlook the richness of human experience, the idea of consciousness, the idea of emotion, the idea of subjective conscious experience. In philosophy, we call this qualia, the idea of a subjective feeling of what it is like to be a thing, having a subjective conscious experience. You don't need to know that for GCSE psychology, but if you ever decide that you want to go into the more philosophical aspects of the brain, thinking about philosophy of mind and going and doing a philosophy degree or philosophy at A-level, then you will become familiar with those kinds of ideas. They're a little bit more ethereal concepts, but they are definitely very, very interesting to study. So what is the contrasting view then? Well, the contrasting view is, of course, holism, the idea that human behavior and mental processes cannot be understood by simply reducing them down to their constituent parts, and instead it needs to be stressed that human beings are more than just the sum of their individual components, and that behaviors ought to be understood within their larger, broader context, whether that be social, cultural, environmental, etc., etc. And just like within reductionism, holism has a number of key constituent schools of thought, key constituent models, key constituent ideas, and it also has its strengths and its criticisms. So, in thinking about them, the first point I want to make is reference to a school of thought known as Gestalt psychology. Now, this is a school of thought which emphasizes, essentially, that the mind actively organizes sensory input into meaningful constituent wholes. Wholes being spelt WHOLES. So, for instance, when you look at an image, you look at a picture of something, we don't just see individual shapes in the sense that a reductionist might argue, but we also perceive whole structures. You perceive an entire landscape, someone's entire face. You don't just see the shapes on the face, which cannot fully be explained by looking at each individual shape or each individual part. So you can't understand the experience, the psychological experience of seeing an image, let's say seeing a face or seeing a landscape in a way that can be explained by reference to individual shapes or reference to the constituent parts of that picture or the constituent parts of that mental process. It has to be understood by thinking of the ways in which we perceive whole structures rather than individual things. When we take a step into the idea of cognitive psychology, we can see that there are holistic theories in that area as well, many which stress that mental processes, so processes like thinking and like memory and like perception, have to be studied as integrated systems. They cannot be studied individually, absent any other feature. So, for example, a person's emotional state might influence how they perceive and how they remember information, suggesting that the mind and emotions are in fact intertwined with each other, which would suggest that if you studied one without studying the other, or you broke down into the constituent parts of one and ignored the other in a way that a reductionist might do, then this could never you could never arrive at a wholly conclusive understanding of that particular process. Within areas such as ecological psychology, the focus is on how behavior is shaped by the interaction between the individual and their environment. So this is a perspective which stresses that an individual cannot be fully understood without considering the larger environmental factors. Now, environmental factors including ecological factors like the actual environment, so in how we understand environmental issues, but also environment in a broader context like socio-cultural contexts. So can we ever understood a person's behavior without reference to their society, without reference to their cultural features, without reference to their history, and without reference to the environment in which they live? So there are definitely a lot of things to consider when thinking about this kind of debate. Now, just like with reductionism, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the strengths and the criticisms. In terms of the strengths of holism, you have, of course, this idea of comprehensive understanding. The idea is that holism provides a more complete view of human behavior. It might feel a little bit you might feel like you get a bit shortchanged if you are thinking about trying to understand human behavior and you go to a reductionist school of thought, let's say, and you only find out that you're going to understand the very minutiae of a very specific part of human behavior. You might come to understand that part very, very well, but you might be kidding yourself into thinking that this is giving you a complete view of human behavior. By taking a holistic approach, you can see that we are incorporating a wide range of factors. We are incorporating social factors, emotional factors, and cognitive factors, and we're looking at it from a holistic perspective rather than trying to ignore and to try and blinker in on very specific issues within this psychology. Holistic approaches also take into account the fact that there is a certain uniqueness associated with individual experiences. So there is a certain sense of unique quality of how people interact with their environment. And this acknowledges the fact that human life is complicated and that human life is essentially developed by and understood by and expressed by their social, their emotional, and their cognitive features of life. And then finally, holistic approaches are often used in psychotherapy and in a lot of ideas of things like humanistic therapies as well, in the sense that in therapy, you are not trying to treat a very specific individual reduced issue. You often think about the fact that the cause of a problem that you might have, a mental issue that you might have, could be the result of a whole host of environmental, social, and historical factors about yourself as a person, rather than trying to deal with one very specific, neurological or hormonal imbalance, for example. In terms of its weaknesses, then, the kinds of weaknesses that you would address when thinking about holism is very similar to the kind of strengths that you see with reductionism. So whereas reductionism is very, very precise, holism is not very precise. There's a lack of precision. They may be too broad and too vague in some areas, making it very difficult to study behavior in a very clear and a very systematic way. It may be harder to design specific treatments for particular mental problems if you are focusing on the holistic view of a person rather than focusing on the individual aspects of that might be the root cause of a problem. Essentially, holism doesn't really give much room to the fact that in some cases, it might just be a single root cause problem that is the result of some kind of issue that needs to be dealt with. So in some cases of mental illness, it might just be the case that it is a hormonal imbalance that can be treated with medication that causes such a mental health problem. In other cases, though, it might be a view that is much more broad, and it might be much more socioeconomic and environmental. But ultimately, holism is equipped for the latter of these kinds of issues, but it's not very equipped for the former. And then finally, holism often places a strong emphasis on personal experience, subjective perception, which can be difficult to quantify in some ways or another. So, what I'm going to do now is finish this lesson by talking a little bit more about the debate between the two views, and then thinking about some attempts in modern psychology to integrate these views together. So, the reductionism and holism debate essentially revolves around the tension between trying to explain behavior through individual components versus trying to explain behavior by considering the broader interconnected systems of the human experience. The reductionists will argue, on the one hand, that in order to understand psychological phenomenon, we need to break them down into their most basic and their most measurable units, be it biological factors, be it behavioral factors, cognitive factors, or even the ways in which we approach these issues from a methodological perspective. By doing so, we are able to pinpoint exact causes of some issues and apply targeted treatments. However, when thinking about the holistic approach, there is the argument that human behavior cannot be fully understood by isolating these factors to individual constituent parts, shall we say, because the interaction between individuals and their environment plays a very crucial role. In more recent years, then, we have seen that there are approaches to try and integrate both views together, trying to bridge the gap, if you will, between reductionism and holism. Now, many psychologists believe that both perspectives are necessary for a comprehensive understanding of human behavior. That might be an approach that you've already come to when thinking about this area of study. You might be thinking, well, why do I have to accept a complete reductionist approach or a complete holistic approach? Why can't I just pick and choose the best parts of both and sort of integrate those views together? Well, psychologists tend to agree with you on that particular fact. And there are a couple of issues, a couple of approaches that you might think about, such as psychosocial models, the approach that combines biology, psychology, and social factors in explaining behavior. It acknowledges that there may be reductionist factors, such as biological minutiae, that are important, but also holistic factors, such as the society and such as environment, that are necessary for understanding human behavior. And then finally, you might see that there are multidisciplinary approaches. Psychologists might use both reductionist methods, such as neuroimaging or genetic studies, as well as holistic approaches, such as considering a person's life history or their socio-cultural context as a way to gain a complete picture and a complete understanding of human behavior.